everybody. This is going to be a YouTube video of going over database relationships inside of decisions. I will be the instructor for today. My name is Jared. I work with the training team, and today's focus is going to be on database relationships. It's a really cool feature on how it manifests itself in decisions. Now, if you come from a database background, all database relationships are is it's just storing different pieces of data in different tables but relating it somehow. So I love this example that we have here where it's the students enrollments and then the classes. So we have these two objects, students and classes, and we understand that students, the action that happens on students and classes is that students become enrolled in a class. And how do traditional database relationships and management store this? Well, what they do is they store what we call a foreign key. That's the identifier of the student and the class, and put it in this joining table. And you see that joining table has the student ID and the class ID. And so that table will store both of those IDs, and then you can join both of those tables together to make one large table temporarily to see what student it belongs to which classes. And you can do this inside of decisions. And it's a lot easier and simpler in decisions because we have a UI-based accessibility user interface. So what could you use these internal data types for in regards to relationships? Well, you can use them with inherent decisions data types. So decisions has a lot of native data types that have inherent relationships with it. So a great example of this is the element registration table. The element registration table is the database table in decisions that stores all of the designer elements you create. So if you create a flow, if you create a rule, if you create a report, if you create anything that exists inside of the studio, or for the portal for that matter, you will see some remnant of it in the element registration table. Now, as I'm sure you've known after working in decisions or using decisions for a little bit, you'll notice that every designer element that we have inside of the application lives inside of a folder. It resides there. So what that means is in decisions, there is an inherent relationship between the entity folder database table, which is the database table that houses all of the folders inside the environment. Every single folder inside your decisions application is reported on in this table. And so what you can do inside of adding a relationship is you can say, hey, what I want to see is I want to see a report that combines all of the element registration items along with the folder. And that's because the component registration or the entity folder ID in the element registration table is the exact same value as the folder ID in the folder table in decisions. You can create a relationship between those two things. So let's continue on. Let's see how how we can understand this. But before we go into that part, we're going to talk about how that this isn't just something that's inherent in decisions. This is something that can also be custom made by user defined types. So on the screenshot here, we have a classic example of the insurance claim application that we have students, both new hires and external students, go through training and have them build. In this build, we create a database relationship between the request history and the validation issues. One request history can have multiple validation issues. Now, what you can do with relationships is you can say, hey, since I know the ID of request history is stored in the request ID field of the validation history, I'm going to add that relationship in decisions so I can report over it. So that's the cool thing about relationships inside of decisions. You can do this manually when you create your own types, or you can take advantage of leveraging the native relationships with the decisions native types inside of it. All right, so that's the concept. But let's understand the reason behind this. So what's the reason behind this? The cool thing about it is you can, once you relate two tables together, you can have a report be sourced from multiple things because you told decisions that these two things are related. So the reports here, they will have all of the fields with the folder table and the element registration table. So in the screenshot here, you'll see that we have the element registration entity name. That's just the name of the designer element. And then on the right, the entity name, that's just the name of the folder of where it resides. And so you can see here, we can report over data, choose data fields from two separate areas of the disparate database tables and display them in a report. Another thing to be aware of is that all the entity actions that you have from both of those different data types will still be present. Depending on which column you click on, you'll have the actions for the designer element actions, or you'll have the folder entity actions when you click on it. So that's things to understand when we are building in decisions and creating these table relationships. Now, how do you set up this relationship? So we're going to walk through this in a little bit, but here's just the concept to understand. In decisions, you create this table relationship by utilizing the create data types and integrations. You pick a connection, whether external or internal, then you pick the tables that you want, and then you pick the related fields. Like, what is the field? So on the screenshot, all the way to the right, you have to pick the field 1 and the field 2, and this can go, more than just one field. You can have multiple fields, and you can connect it that way. So that's how you can configure relationships in decisions. Now let's talk about configuring it in a report. So how would you add this to the report to have that kind of menu that I showed earlier? Well, what you do is you pick one of the database tables that you've added the relationship for. And you'll notice when you click add again, you'll have the ability to access the extension data, and more importantly, you can access the related table. And in this case, entity folder and element registration are related. And then when you click on data fields, you have access to both the element registration fields and the folder data fields. Another cool thing with the properties of this data sources is you can define what type of join type you want. So you can say, hey, I want this to be an inner join, a right join, a left join. You can define any of those different joins that you have in the database world, you can configure here. All right, what are the use cases for this? Well, if you ever need to join two tables together and they must be related because they paint the story, that's one of the reasons why you'd want to do this. You can do this with the local connection, which is the database that Decisions is installed against. You can also do this externally with an external database integration. So if you have tables that are related that you want to connect, you can do it with Decisions. Second is, right, you have custom data source reporting. So you can say, hey, I want to report over all these three tables because they have related fields that will display the data in a way that's effective for end users. And then the one all the way to the right, you can relate also your user-defined types. Let's say I have a purchase request application that has three different types of requests, right? I have just the request itself, but then I'm going to store the ID of like request type ID. And then I have three request types. I can have a software request, I can have a general request, or I can add a project request. And then those two things, depending on which one of those two request types I've create, I'll store that ID of that particular request inside of that purchase request data table. And then when I report over it, I can combine all those three tables together and make it one long, nice and easy way to read all of the related tables in one report. So I can see what is happening across all those records that are being created or all those purchase requests. All right, I'm going to take a pause. I got a couple more minutes, so let's go ahead and dive into this, and I want to kind of demonstrate this so we can kind of see like how this works. So immediately what we're going to do is you're going to want to go into a designer folder of some sort, right? Once you go into a designer folder, we're going to create data types and integrations. Then when we want to create the table relationship, we click on database integrations. We're going to go to add relationship, and then we get this menu here. I'm going to say this is example relationship right here, and then I'm going to create this connection right here. I could choose between my external connections that I have, or I can just say local. I'm just going to pick local for the sake of this example. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the element registrations as the example, since I already mentioned how the entity folder ID is the same as the folder ID in the folder table. So entity folder ID is the folder that the designer element resides in, and the table here is going to be the folder. I think I have to type entity underscore folder is the actual name of that folder. There we go, boom. And then the field we're going to relate to field 1, it's tied to that way as well, is going to be the folder ID and the entity folder ID of the DBO element registration table. Now, you may be tempted because you'll notice that I have an entity ID field here for the folder data structure or the folder data structure as well, but you don't want to grab the entity folder ID because, right, the folder may not exist in the same location as your designer elements because designer elements reside inside of the folder. And so the entity folder ID is the exact same thing in the fact that it just says this is where this folder resides. It could reside in another folder or may not reside in another folder. So the main thing you want to learn from here is that the folder ID of the entity underscore folder table is the exact same as the entity folder ID in the element registration table. So let's go ahead. I'm going to add this relationship. Boom, relationship gets created. You see this thing that exists in the project called example relationship. Then what I do is I'll go into my reports, click a generic report. I'm going to say this is showing off relationship. Enter to create. And then all I have to do is pick the element registration folder or any of the two tables, element registration or entity folder data source. Once I pick that, you'll see that now I have, let me go ahead and find it one more time. The element registration, I want to say it's the element data source right here. And then when I click on this again, you'll be able to see I have this add related table and I can add the entity folder. And once I do that, now I can have access to both data types of the entity folder archive and entity folder root, or I can get the entity name of the folder. So we're going to grab entity folder name, so that's the name of the folder. And then if I grab the entity name, just the normal entity name, that's just going to be the name of the designer element. So let me go ahead and find that entity name right here. And so you can see here, this is a solution copy rule. So this is a rule, and this is input. So these are on the right, the actual names of the designer elements, and on the left is the name of the actual folders. And that's relationships. That's how you set them up in decisions, and that's how you can configure it to have a nice, neat view. All right, so that's going to conclude the database relationships kind of demonstration. The training team will be releasing videos and content approximately like every Friday. We'll have a new video up on the official Decisions Training YouTube channel. So go ahead and like and comment and subscribe from that. And if you have any suggestions of what content you want to see next, please email training@decisions.com with the subject line of YouTube idea, and just send us a brief explanation of what that is, because we want to make content about decisions more readily accessible and more relevant to you. That's it for today. You guys have a great day.